And our next speaker is Isabelle McDonald-Gilmartin. She's a PhD student at the University of California, Davis in the Tucker Lab. And she will be talking to us today about continuous observations, looking at stereotypic behaviors in cows.
Thank you for the introduction, Lindsay, and thank you so much for having me. So my name is Isabelle McDonald. I'm going to be talking about a chapter of my dissertation looking at breed differences and abnormal behavior performance in dairy cattle, which you've already had a brief introduction to in my advisor's talk yesterday, Dr. Cassandra Tucker. So I'm going to be talking about two different behaviors. So dairy cattle perform a variety of abnormal behaviors, the first being tongue rolling, which you're seeing in this first video, which is where the animal moves her tongue in a circular motion or holds her tongue in a circular position. And you'll note that it's very repetitive in nature. So this video is not in a loop. This is all one bout. We also see that dairy cattle perform a behavior called non-nutritive oral manipulation, which is where she chews, licks, or sucks or bites on things that are in her environment that are not nutritive. So here being metal bars in her pen. Evidence for tongue rolling performance shows that the behavior is present in all age classes. So we see them in calves, in heifers, and in cows. And studies also indicate that they're performed for a relatively low percent of time. So for example, nearly 0% of the day, so as low as less than 0.1%, and up to 4.5%. So overall, relatively rare. Evidence for non-nutritive oral manipulation, however, shows that the behavior, while also present in all age classes, is performed for a higher percentage of time compared to tongue rolling. So for example, in one study done by my colleague, Dr. Blair Downey, they found that some animals perform the behavior for 19% of the day. So very large percents of time. And when we think about these behaviors, we also think about them in the context of the breeds that perform them. So in the United States, the two most common breeds of dairy cattle are Jerseys and Holsteins. Many people know anecdotally that they believe that Jerseys perform more of these abnormal behaviors than Holsteins, but there are limited studies exploring this question, with one, again, by my colleague Blair Downey, which showed that Jerseys did perform more of these behaviors than Holsteins, as well as another study that looked at Jerseys compared to Jersey-Holstein crosses. And we found in, again, both of these experiments that Jerseys did perform more ARBs than Holsteins did. So we predict in this study that I'll continue to describe to you that we would see this similar effect. And there are a couple of reasons that drive this possible behavioral difference between the breeds. First is that Jerseys spend more time chewing while they graze compared to Holsteins. They also eat more feed per unit of body weight. And there's a suggested genetic influence, which is again shown by this study that looked at these Jerseys versus these crosses. And so when thinking about a study that I wanted to run looking at these behaviors in both Jerseys and Holsteins, we also had to consider what age of cattle to choose. And so as I described, we know that they're performed in all age classes, so we kind of have quite a choice to make. So instead, I looked to one of my previous projects, which was examining how these behaviors develop over the first 6 months of life. And so on this graph, you'll see days on the x-axis with animals being weaned at 65 days of life. And then the average percent of time they spent performing non-nutritive on the y-axis. And my results from this study show that the behaviors were highly prevalent. So they were again performed throughout these first 6 months of life. And you can see, again, most is happening around this weaning period. However, we know that most of the literature on these behaviors is focused on this weaning stage. So the milk-fed calves are the most well-studied age class for ARBs. So instead, we thought, because there's less information about these post-weaned calves, which I've highlighted with the pink arrow here, that would be a really interesting population to look at since they're relatively understudied. So our overall study goal was to examine breed differences in weaned calves between Jerseys and Holsteins. We also were thinking about why or how we could look at the different behaviors maybe in a more specific way. So because we have these very specific rationales about why Jerseys might perform more of these behaviors, again, including that they spend more time chewing, they spend more time eating per unit of body weight, that perhaps there are specific behaviors that are also different within these abnormal behavior categories. So for example, non-nutritive manipulation can take many forms. I said earlier, they are behaviors that are performed when the animal is chewing on something that's not food or water. And so there was a previous study conducted by Cassandra Tucker and Blair Downey where they split non-nutritive into separate categories, into feed bin non-nutritive, so licking or manipulating an empty feed bin, water trough non-nutritive, where they're manipulating parts of the pipes or an empty water trough, bedding consumption, so here we bed them on rice hulls, so chewing and often trying to ruminate on that bedding. And then finally, other non-nutritive as this more catch-all, so anything like wires or walls or other types of things that they can manipulate. And so what we wanted to know was, are there actual differences amongst these specific subclasses of non-nutritive manipulation? And as I stated previously, animals spend a relatively large portion of their day performing this behavior, so we could gain a really clear picture and a lot of knowledge from understanding these different categories and how they kind of might break out. We also saw, in addition to breaking non-nutritive into more categories, we want to think more accurately and precisely as we can about these behaviors. And this really came to mind when we were looking at this one particular example of non-nutritive manipulation, which I'm showing here in this calf. So you'll note that she puts her bar in her mouth, but then moves her tongue in a motion that to us really resembles tongue rolling. So as you'll remember, this curling of the tongue that comes on often out beyond the mouth. And so we decided in this project that instead of calling this non-nutritive as we have previously, that we would actually delineate our behaviors further and call this object tongue rolling, for lack of more creative naming on my part. So we decided we would delineate non-nutritive manipulation into these 4 types. And then we would also look at object tongue rolling in addition to tongue rolling, which they're distinctive because object tongue rolling, they actually have something in their mouth. Tongue rolling, they don't have anything in their mouth. So after splitting from just non-nutritive and tongue rolling into these 6 distinct behaviors, we also saw or started to think about how these behaviors might fulfill different motivations. So for example, with bedding consumption, we would describe this behavior as consumatory. So the animal is actually consuming, chewing, and again, trying to ruminate on the actual rice hulls. And so they're really attempting perhaps to fill their gut with food. And so again, we could label this on the left end of this kind of continuum as a consumatory behavior. The remaining non-nutritive and object tongue rolling, we would describe, again, maybe I need to work on my creative naming here, as a behavior that is something in the mouth. So they're putting something in their mouth. They're not actually able to consume that thing, but they're able to manipulate something with their tongue, their teeth, whatever. Again, potentially fulfilling that oral motivation. And then finally, we have tongue rolling, which we would label as a vacuum behavior. So it's occurring in the absence of any physical stimuli. So the animal's not consuming anything, chewing anything. So these questions about the differing motivations for the behaviors play an interesting role in my final question for this project, which was again to explore these breed differences in the context of these 6 behaviors. So again, the overall study objectives were to look at how Holsteins and Jerseys differ amongst this continuum. And I really think when we were first talking about how they differ between this consumatory versus kind of vacuum ends of the spectrum, that perhaps we would expect Jerseys to perform more on this left end of the spectrum, because if we see that they're performing more behaviors like chewing more on their food or grazing more compared to Holsteins, then perhaps they would also spend more time doing the chewing and licking types of behaviors compared to a vacuum behavior. And so the methods we utilized for this project was to video record 50 post-weaned calves who were on average 102 days of age, approximately 1 month after they were weaned. They were each filmed for 24 hours, so a total of more than 1,200 hours of video data. And we scored 6 behaviors on Boris software, using intra and inter-rater reliability to check all of our training. So I performed the intra-class correlations for myself, and then looking at the number and length of the bouts of the behavior. And then we also performed regressions and ICCs to look at the actual length of the bouts. And if you want more detail on the reliability, if you didn't happen to make the workshop yesterday, you can check out animalbehaviorreliability.com, which also was created by 2 and more of my co-authors. For today's results, I'm just going to show you a subset of this analysis using 16 post-weaned calves, 8 Jerseys and 8 Holsteins, and they were filmed for 8 hours. To orient you to my graph, I will be showing you the behaviors on the x-axis and then the percent of visible time on the y-axis. So this was excluding any times where the animal happened to have her head in a corner where we couldn't see her mouth. And I'll be showing you Holsteins in gray and Jerseys in brown. We found no significant differences between breeds for bedding, with the behavior being performed for only 0.3% of observations. We found no significant differences for breeds for water trough non-nutritive, for an average of 0.25% of observations. We found a tendency for breeds to differ for feed bin non-nutritive, performed for Jerseys for 0.52% of time and for Holsteins 0.07% of time, so relatively rare for Holsteins. We found a significant difference for breeds for other non-nutritive manipulation, with Jerseys spending significantly more time than Holsteins, spending 5.2% of visible time performing the behavior, and Holsteins spending only 2.1% of time. Jerseys also spent significantly more time performing object tongue rolling compared to Holsteins, spending 0.55% of time, again with this behavior being very rare in Holsteins. And then finally, we detected no significant differences for tongue rolling, with the behavior being performed on average for 1% of time. An interesting thing to note about the performance of other non-nutritive in my results is that they very closely resemble those found in the literature. So for example, in a paper, again, done by Blair and Cassandra Tucker, they found a significant difference between Jerseys and Holsteins as well, for very, very similar percents of time being spent. I also think it's worth noting our error bars, which are standard error in these figures for some of our behaviors. So for example, looking at tongue rolling, we see very considerable variability happening. And so upon looking at these values, I had a suspicion that it was likely due to the individual variation we noted in our population while performing these observations. And so I decided to pull that out to illustrate that to you here. And so when we actually pull each individual animal out as each of these unique dots overlaying these plots, so here the x-axis being the same, but the y-axis now being the number of behavior performances in 8 hours, you can really see some of these outliers that stand out, that at least I think stand out, which I highlight with some stars here. You really see high variability being detected. And so in summary, we found that we've detected significant differences in feed bin, other non-nutritive manipulation, and object tongue rolling. And we observed quite tremendous individual variation in our population. And our next steps for this project, including finishing the analysis for the full 24 hours for all 50 animals, and running a cluster analysis to examine if certain behaviors are related to one another. And then I would just like to thank the UC Davis Dairy Facility, all of my committee members and co-authors, my undergraduate interns, and of course the cows. And with that, I'll take questions.